What's up, guys? It's Kelsey, and I'm here with the CAD. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to CAD Calls with Kelsey. As always, I'm your host, Kelsey Kuykendall, and today we're going to be talking with artist Amir H. Fallah. Amir is a figurative painter whose work explores issues of identity, representation, the immigrant experience, and the history of portraiture. And his work is really representative of his own life experience, but also the lives of his sitters, whom he interviews individually. And Amir's work is incredibly visually rich and filled with symbolism, so today's interview is particularly excellent and really exciting. I had a blast talking to Amir. Today's recording also takes place in the chair, so I will see you all on the other side. Enjoy! One thing that I found when researching your work is you've described this feeling of proverbial like homelessness or placelessness that you've felt throughout your life. And I wanted to ask you to just sort of dive into that a little bit more and give us some background on how that provides an entry into the work.
Well, I was born in Iran. I was born during the Iranian Revolution. And then so my family left shortly after that, not by force, but there was a war happening with Iraq that ironically the US was backing. And the war was pretty bloody, like hundreds of thousands of people had died in it. And it was getting to the point where they kept recruiting younger and younger soldiers because they were just like, all the men were dying, essentially.
Right.
And so that coupled with the revolution, my parents just felt like it was very unstable there. And so we were going to move to Europe. And we had this family, like a distant relative that was going to help us with like the voyage of like figuring out the paperwork, getting a visa. We're going to apply for like refugee status to go, I think, to Austria. And through a bizarre chain of events, this relative of ours actually ended up stealing all of our money and the money of like the 4 or 5 other families that he was kind of guiding.
Wow.
And left us stranded in Turkey. And so we were in Turkey. My parents had closed their businesses, sold off their homes, got rid of everything essentially. And they were in their like late 20s, and they were, they didn't want to go back to Iran with their tail between their legs after they told like their friends and family, like, hey, we're gonna move to, Europe and all that. There's a lot of pride involved. And so my dad during the Shah's reign in Iran was trained by the US Air Force. So America during the Shah's era was an ally of Iran's, and America used to actually train our military in Iran. So my dad actually spent quite a bit of time in America and spoke English. And so we decided to apply for refugee status to come here. And so we were told that we would have to wait a year and a half in Turkey, a country where we didn't speak the language, we didn't know anybody, we had no money. And so pretty much we just lived in the slums of Turkey for about a year and a half in like temporary apartments, like we didn't have a refrigerator for like 6 months because like my parents couldn't afford it. I mean, it was just like crazy. We went from being like middle class in Iran to like just being like completely poor in Turkey, and then we ended up in the US. And so when we came to the US, I was like maybe 6 years old. I didn't speak any English, and I was like in a third country within 3 years where I had to like learn the language and try to assimilate. And so I've been in America the longest, but I lived on 3 different continents and spoke 4 different. I lived in 4 different countries and spoke 3 different languages before the age of 7. So for me, the idea of like a homeland or a country is really abstract, and although America feels the closest to a place called home because of a lot of social issues, it really, it's like home sometimes,
Mhm.
depending on what the politics are and what's going on. It's like you almost feel like a second class citizen in a way, not on a day to day basis, but every once in a while you're kind of reminded of, like, quote unquote, your place. But if
Mhm.
I went back to Iran, I wouldn't be considered Iranian. They would look at me as completely Americanized.
Mhm.
So this idea of like a homeland, or like, absolute patriotism to any country, is a very abstract idea to me, because I've lived everywhere and I've lived with a lot of different cultures. I lived in Italy briefly. We lived in for like 3 months at like a refugee, like middle point. Like, it wasn't like a shelter, but it was like this like compound that America would like send their refugees. You could be in Italy for a few months and then you would come here. So I lived in Europe for a while as a young kid. So all of that has kind of led to this kind of feeling of like, on any given day, I feel just as Mexican as I do Iranian. I'm not
Mhm.
Mexican at all, but
Mhm.
but for instance, in Los Angeles, everybody thinks I'm Mexican just because of my skin color, especially after I started shaving my head. You know, um, and when I lived on the East Coast, everybody thought I was Indian because I'm very dark skinned for an Iranian, and I look closer to Indian than I do Iranian. So I don't culturally, I don't really fit in anywhere really. I'm kind of like a cultural mutt.
Mhm. You don't feel the physical representation of identity really embodies much of identity at all, and that sort of plays into why you've created these veiled figures.
So, you know, like I said, no one ever gets my nationality right,
Mhm.
ever. That's been kind of like a constant my entire life. Even Iranians get they think I'm Indian or something like that,
Mhm. Mhm.
or Mexican. So that's been a constant my whole life. And then about like 16, 17 years ago, I met my now wife, and she's Puerto Rican, but she is a fair-skinned redhead, like a natural redhead.
Mhm.
Both her parents are Puerto Rican, and she doesn't look like what she is either. She looks Irish. She looks kind of like Molly Ringwald.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, she has freckles. I mean, it's like when you think Puerto Rican in your head, you're not thinking what my wife looks like. And
Mhm.
so, being around her for almost 2 decades, I've realized like what she looks like doesn't really describe who she is either.
Mhm.
And now we have a 5-year-old kid, and he's kind of this like, olive skinned brunette, who doesn't really look like either one of us.
Mhm.
And so I started, I was doing these veiled paintings already, thinking about, like identity, and how like your skin color, or like your physical features, they're very superficial ways of describing who someone is. And then historically, portraiture has been about describing what you look like, right?
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
you dress, the way you communicate to the world who you are, right? And um, and I feel that it's not a very accurate or interesting way to describe someone. So I started thinking about, well, how do you take the history of portraiture and kind of turn it on its head, or deconstruct it, or expand upon it? And
Mhm.
so that's where like the veiling of these figures came about. So for every one of those paintings, they're portraits of real people. So I go to their homes, I do a photo shoot with them, and I almost do like an archaeological dig of their lives. So I
Mhm.
do kind of like an informal interview where we start talking about the different objects in their home, like the wallpaper on their walls, or like the quilt that's on their bed, and where they come from. And through these inanimate objects, oftentimes I get to know the person in like a very deep and meaningful way.
Mhm.
Um, so like, there might be a quilt on the bed, and they'll say, "Oh, my grandmother made this." And so I'll start asking about their grandmother and their relationship to her. And then I'll find out like their grandmother died of cancer, and it was a really hard time for them. And it's an alternative way to like kind of get to know someone
Mhm.
through these objects. So I take all those stories and discussions that we have, and I use that as content, or like as raw material for the painting. So there's a lot of symbolism that happens in the paintings. Everything in the painting is very specific,
Right.
from the colors to the patterns to the fabrics, the objects that are there, the composition sometimes, the
Mhm.
pose. It's very deliberate. So there's
Mhm.
almost like a conceptual component to these portraits where there's a lot of research done.
Mm-hmm.
And that research dictates what the painting is going to look like within the parameters that I set for, like my work.
Right. Yeah, I actually want to share my screen. So this is actually a work that I wanted to talk about in relation to how you choose what objects you want to put into these works. Because some of them are very obviously related to identity formation. They're like heirloom objects, like you just talked about, quilt. But something like this toy helicopter, or I saw motorcycle helmets. Some of them are a little less obvious. Could you explain a little bit about how you decide to put an object into the work?
Sure. So usually it's just something will catch my eye visually, right? Or something that they say will kind of pique my interest, and I'll ask more, and then the objects come from that. So, like for
Mm-hmm.
instance, this painting is like a very personal one. It's a painting of my father-in-law, and so my father-in-law flies these remote control helicopters. He's obsessed with them. He builds them, and as far as I've known, every time I go to Miami to visit him, he shows me these like it's just his hobby. So this is his like prized helicopter. So when I was photographing him, I knew I wanted to feature one of these things because it's a big part of his like identity and his life. And I asked him like if he could only have one, and he pulls this one out, and it's like wrapped in plastic, and so it's so that's where the helicopter comes from. And then I just over the years have noticed that he's always wearing camouflage, like camouflage shorts, camouflage shirt. Uh, he loves camo. So in this and he's also very patriotic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's also Puerto Rican. So the camouflage, I made up the camo, obviously. Like he doesn't own like a red, white, and blue camo,
Mm-hmm.
but it represents the Puerto Rican flag, but also the American flag, and then also this thing that this pattern that he wears.
Mm-hmm.
And then also we've had a lot of like fun discussions over the years, and he's really interested in the idea of like aliens or life forms outside of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
and so that's where that image of that spaceship kind of pulling someone up, uh,
I see.
so again, that image isn't something that he owns, but it's a discussion that we've had several times about whether we both think they're out there, which is where
Mm-hmm.
the title of the painting comes from. So
Mm-hmm.
everything's very, so you can see like I'll take all these discussions that we have, and then it's like a puzzle, and then I'm trying to figure out how do these things kind of fit in with one
Right.
another. So everything in a
Uh,
painting has some sort of meaning, kind of like what I'm talking about.
mm-hmm. And one thing I really want to ask about too is these like wild botanical forms, which they come up in almost every work, I feel like. Are
Right.
those things that you are seeing in these subjects' homes, or is there something else you're trying to unpack with those?
So the plants have, there's multiple reasons why this botanical motif comes back over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've noticed in almost every person's home that I've painted is that humans have this incredible desire to connect with nature, sometimes subconsciously. So if you go into somebody's home, they're gonna have plants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flowers. I actually find it very bizarre when people don't. It kind of creeps me out, especially after doing this project for so long. So I think it says a lot about, we have this like animalistic instinct to bring nature indoors. It's almost part of like our evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one reason. But also, if you look closely at the plants that I paint, there'll be a succulent from like a kind of like a desert climate next to an orchid that you would find in like a tropical forest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tropical rainforest. So a lot of times there's this like mashup of plant life from different cultures, And for me, that also talks about how imagery and symbols and ideas and cultures migrate. So historically, plants were migrated two different ways. They either migrated by man, so people would, they'd get on a boat and
Mm-hmm.
they'd come to America, and they would bring these foreign plants with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or plant. Actually, there's three different ways. So another way is a seed can travel hundreds of miles through wind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can go from one climate to another climate and migrate. And then the third is birds and other animals can migrate these seeds that turn into plants on their body or in their fur or feathers. So this idea of these migrating cultures, and not just culturally, but like ethnically, like my wife is a redhead because if you go to, Puerto Rico and Caribbean, historically their backgrounds are from Spain, where there is a lot of redheads because it's right
Mm-hmm.
next to Europe. Um, so those are some of the reasons. And then also, a lot of times the plants are also almost like a stand-in for people sometimes. They're like a life form that isn't like an animal or a person, but it's something that's alive and like literally creates oxygen. So sometimes they're in the paintings because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're sort of wild, proliferative, like the way that they're painted can feel like spreading or moving out
Yeah.
from maybe where they would be natively planted.
Yeah, they're always kind of entangled and unruly,
Mhm.
because I think cultures are unruly. There's a lot of chaos within people, right? So like things
Mhm.
are clashing and colliding, but also living harmoniously, right? So I like this idea of like, you don't know if some of these plants are weeds and they're like taking over, like an invasive uh plant, or if they're living in harmony, or a little bit of both, which I think is a great way to kind of describe people as a whole,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
everyone's on the brink of fighting even when they're at peace.
Mhm. So the combination of all of these different forms serves to really create like this new form of representation
Right.
while completely obscuring the faces of the sitters.
I guess the way I think about it is, I, I like polarities a lot. Like I like to do two exact opposite things at the same time with an artwork. So for instance, I want to make these like really rich, ornate, seductive paintings that kind of pull viewers in,
Mhm.
just through very formal means, right? So like color, embellishment,
Mhm.
ornamentation, these things
Mhm.
that are just like visually beautiful, right? It
Mhm.
pulls you in. But then I like to push back while I'm so like so anytime you cover someone's face, it kind of creeps people out. It's kind of off-putting. It's pushing you back, right?
Mhm.
So it creates
Mhm.
an air of mystery, and it makes the picture a little bit more complicated. Because I mean, I really realize that I'm walking this fine line of like working within the tradition of like both Eastern and Western ornamentation and
Yeah.
embellishment decoration. And so I'm always cautious to add as much tension as I can so that it doesn't become purely decorative. I'm not trying to illustrate these people's lives, or I'm not trying to create a documentary. I'm trying to create a certain level of mystery that not doesn't necessarily confuse people, but hopefully keeps them there and keeps the conversation open enough that they can kind of come to their own conclusions and not necessarily see themselves in the figures, but try to kind of put together the puzzle pieces.
Mhm. Yeah, and speaking of ornamentation and histories of art, I really wanted to explore with you. Let's see. This piece is very, very exciting. So this is a stained glass work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, could you speak a little bit to your decision to enter into this medium? And I think it's a perfect medium for your work, and it's really poetic. But could you speak a little bit more to that and who this figure is, and just give us some background on this?
Sure. So this is the second stained glass piece that I've made, and Initially, I got into stained glass by accident. A friend of mine was working with Judson Studios, who's a fabricator for this piece. And she said, hey, have you ever thought about doing stained glass? I think your work would be perfect for it. And I said, no, I haven't thought about it because I haven't had access to it, but yeah, I would love to. I love stained glass. And so she's like, go and check out these people. And so when she gave me the address, I realized that they're less than a mile from my home, their studio. And so Judson is like a 5-generation stained glass studio. It's over 100 years old, right in Highland Park, right by my home. And so I started a conversation with them, and they gave me a tour of their studio and showed me how they make the stained glass. And I was shocked how similar the process of stained glass is to how I construct my paintings. So it's a different techniques, but the way they put images together is very similar. And so, we started this dialogue with the studio, and I ended up doing this one collaborative project with them that went really well. It was a self-portrait for a show that I had at Shulamit Nazarian in 2017. And then, so I followed it up the next year with this piece, which is called Offering. And so this is part of a series of portraits of immigrants living in the US that I've been making. So this is and it's based off of a painting of mine. So it's a portrait of a young Iranian American artist who moved to the US to study art. So she came here when she was like 18 or 19 and moved in with relatives, and she's really like out of her comfort zone because she spent the majority of her life in Iran. She wasn't like me where she came here at a young age. And so the reason I like stained glass is because it has this very rich ancient history that I'm very interested in. But then Judson Studios does something very interesting where they don't just do stained glass, but they also do fused glass, which is like a process of melting layers of colored glass onto one another. So the entire figure is actually fused glass, and then the background is stained glass. And what's interesting about that is that it's the melding of a very old technique and a new technique. And not many people in the world do that. They're one of the only places that make things like this. And so conceptually, I thought that was interesting, kind of fit into my work, that the medium itself fit into my work, because I'm working in this, I'm working with portraiture, which is like one of the oldest forms of art making or image making. But then I'm trying to turn it on its head and like breathe new life into it. And Judson Studios is kind of aligned with that same idea, where they're taking a very old technique and experimenting with it. So for all the stained glass works that I've done, we've had to invent new processes that no one's ever done before to achieve the look of my paintings.
I would say too that the history of stained glass being sort of a form that embodies both presence and absence. It's sort of there and it's not, and it's about seeing as well, that you can. It's a window. I think is something that can relate to your work in a really interesting way.
Right. Yeah, and this piece is you can't see it because this is photographed at night. So this piece is actually backed with like a custom LED panel. So it hangs on the wall like a painting does. And there's just a plug, and you can plug it in, and it can be illuminated even in a room that doesn't have windows, which has a really beautiful effect, because you kind of, with traditional stained glass, you're at the mercy of the sun. And then, so now I'm actually working on a large public art project with Judson Studios for the city of LA that'll be out middle of 2021. And it's like a 3-part large monumental outdoor sculpture. So as far as I know, it's going to be one of the first like major stained glass outdoor sculptures. Because usually, stained glass goes in a building. It's not necessarily used in sculptural formats, especially outdoor sculpture. So
Right.
that'll be interesting.
That will be. That's super exciting.
Yeah.
Let's see. I wanted to go, okay, here's an excellent example of what I wanted to ask you about. So changing subjects a little bit here, I wanted to talk to you about the use of these borders within the works and
Mhm.
how the figures sort of are entangled around them, and then the figures exist in the space of the viewer, but also back in the space of the painting. And I'm wondering what made you start using these, and what is the function of them?
Well, so this is a more recent painting, made in, within the last 6, 7 months. And so I started, um, I'm very interested in the idea of deconstruction, both conceptually and formally within the paintings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've started this process of trying to figure out, again, how do you get two things at the same time? How do you create space and then negate space? So how do you create a painting that simultaneously feels flat and has like rich depth?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started creating, I've had these those kind of like thin lines that kind of go through, weave in and out of the painting. That's a constant in all of my work.
Mm-hmm.
But I've started kind of setting them up in this kind of like minimalist grid within the painting, and they weave in and out of the space. And in certain parts, they push the picture plane forward, and in certain parts, they flatten it out. And some parts have shadows, so it feels like almost like a trompe l'oeil object
Mm-hmm.
sitting in front of the
Mm-hmm.
figure or an object. And in other parts, it has no shadow, and it just works as a flat graphic element. Um, and I started also breaking up the picture plane and having these little vignettes, so paintings within paintings. So
Mm-hmm.
like that figure in the top left corner, you know, is its own little miniature painting that's inset into this painting. And I like the idea of creating a painting that's 10 or 20 paintings
Mm-hmm.
at once. I'm a maximalist in every sense of the world. So for me, it's more is always more. And I have a background in graphic design and book and magazine publishing. And I started laying out these newer paintings almost like you would lay out a magazine or a newspaper or a book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there'll be the main article, if it's like a newspaper, you have the big headline, and then you have like the image caption, you have the small article tying in, you have the image credits at the bottom. So I'm thinking about compositionally, I'm thinking about the painting set up in that format, and like a magazine or a book. So those lines, those borders or lines, almost work as a style guide, which is something that like graphic designers use to lay out magazines and books and
Mm-hmm.
newspapers.
And I would say your use of color relates very much to that aesthetic as well, which I think is sort of unexpected when you're thinking about these issues of identity formation.
Sure. So naturally, I've always just been interested in like very bold, kind of poppy colors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over time, I've been trying to again complicate that, or like throw, kind of like this kind of like dark ochre color into the mix, which kind of like fights against like the bright purples and reds and blues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but historically, that comes out of my interests, as a teenager growing up, being interested in skateboard graphics, or graffiti art, which is something I did for many years, or
Mm-hmm.
graphic design and illustration. So I like the idea of taking these things from popular culture, but then mixing it with also a palette that's taken from like a Persian miniature or some sort of historical imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that idea of like these two different cultures clashing, these two, high and low art clashing at the same time, is something that I'm interested in, and it creates a hybrid, right? And I think that ultimately speaks to who I am. I mean, I'm a giant hybrid. I'm a cultural hybrid. I'm very interested in like very disparate cultures, so like when I was in art school, I was taking figurative drawings by day, and then at night I was sneaking around doing graffiti. So like the mashup of these two different worlds that don't really have much to do with one another, colliding, is interesting to me. So just how the plant life in the paintings are kind of entangling themselves, and they're butting against each other and kind of fighting each other, but then also trying to figure out a way to live together. I try to formally do the same thing. And a lot of times in my paintings, if you look at them up close, you'll see there's areas where I'm like glaze painting them and doing a very like traditional technique, and in other parts I'm painting something that looks like folk art, or a magazine like a clip art, or like an old vintage silk screen, or areas are like done with like tiny dots. So I'm really trying to pull from a wide array of like references and try to combine them in some sort of unexpected manner.
Fascinating. Well, I just want to end with asking you where we can check out your work, what you've got going on, and where we can see you mid-pandemic.
Well, I had a survey of my work at MoCA Tucson that closed earlier this year, but the catalog for that just came out, which if anyone's interested, they can get it on my site. And then in early spring, my show at Denny Dimon Gallery in New York will be opening up. That was also supposed to happen in October, but it got pushed back. And currently, I'm in a group show opening next week at Library Street Collective in Detroit. So
nice.
Those are like the most immediate things coming up.
Very cool. And then obviously the stained glass public artwork as well.
Yeah, that'll be coming out in LA in I think April of 2021. It's a 4-year project, so I'm looking forward to be able to share it with people.
All right, everyone. That was the amazing Amir Fallah. I hope you all enjoyed this interview. I sure enjoyed talking to him, and I'd like to thank Amir for sitting down and having this conversation with me. It was a pleasure, as always. Also, he's got a ton of stuff coming up, so I'm going to link to a few of his shows. And also be sure to keep an eye out next year for that stained glass public work that's going to be going up. And I hope to see you all next time on CAD Calls with Kelsey.